The World Bank and IMF spring meetings that are currently being held in Washington are discussing a global economy that's entering a pronounced slowdown. The World Bank forecasts global growth at 3.2% in 2022, down from its previous estimate of 4.1%. This compares with estimated 5.7% growth in 2021. Joining us to discuss the outlook for the MENA region in particular is Chief Economist at the World Bank, Roberta Gatti. Thanks so much for joining us. Ms. Gatti, your report shows MENA saw a strong recovery in H2 2021, and this year growth should accelerate to 5.2%. Can you break down this projection for us by GCC, North Africa, and Levant subregions?
Thank you, Ramia. And let me just focus us on two key figures. In 2021, the region grew by a modest 3.3%, and now is forecast to grow, as you were saying, by 5.2%. So this 5.2% looks pretty buoyant, and this is lifted by oil prices, which are lifting the growth of both the Gulf Cooperation countries, the GCC countries, and of the developing oil exporters in MENA. However, the oil importers are taking a hit by the increase of fuel prices and by the increase in food prices. And so their growth will be more attenuated at about 4%. Something that I wanted to point out is that the numbers that we're talking about are likely biased upwards, and economists will say that is larger than what they ought to be, because we don't have data or are able to have precise enough forecasts for Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, and Libya. Something that I wanted to point out is that beyond the unevenness of growth, which is driven by the relatively different exposure to the price shocks that are going on in the world, this growth is actually insufficient to bring the region back to the level of GDP per capita that was before the pandemic. And so we estimated about 11 out of 17 countries in the region will not get back to GDP per capita, which is arguably a better measure of living standards that they had before the pandemic.
11 out of 17 countries, that's a huge challenge. Now, your report forecasts growth slowing to 3.5% in 2023, and many factors could undermine growth, like fluctuating oil prices, COVID outbreaks, high debt, the war in Ukraine. What will really drive the slowdown here?
Well, growth forecasts are uncertain, but you're pointing out that some of the major drivers of this uncertainty. We have uncertainty about the intensity of the Ukraine war. And even for the countries for which this is translating into a windfall because of the increase in fuel prices, there is no reason to be complacent. Oil prices are expected to move down to about $70 per barrel by 2026. So it's a moment to save some of this windfall and or spend it smartly while pressing ahead with reforms. The region is also not out of the woods yet with the pandemic. There is a broad variability in vaccination rates, moving from single digits in fragile countries to north of 80% in rich countries. And we know that health systems in the region were unprepared. And finally, the hike in food prices is the one that is hitting the poor and vulnerable the most. And this is something about which we can really do something about.
So should developed economies then increase efforts to help the global economy recover from challenges? And in what ways exactly? I mean, this seems to be one of the key messages coming out of this week's meetings.
So the COVID-19 pandemic shock was a regressive shock across countries and within countries. Now we had food price inflation, which is essentially a regressive tax. What does it mean? That the poor and vulnerable are suffering the most. Just to give you an example, Moroccan households at the bottom 10% of the income distribution spend 51% of their expenditure on food and 11% on energy. While if you look at the top 10% of the income distribution, these families spend about 30% between food and energy. This means that poor and vulnerable families are taking the strongest hit. There are ways to alleviate this, and targeted cash transfer and rallying support around targeted cash transfer is very important because these are fundamental to help those in need. They're also preferable to increasing food and oil price subsidies because these ones tend to be indiscriminate in the society, and they also benefit the better off. A message of our report is that better data are a cheap and important solution to help navigate this uncertainty. In terms of the pandemic, we know that good data have given fundamental feedback loops to system and to people to protect themselves from the disease. And in terms of growth forecast, we show in this report that better data ecosystems help to have more accurate and less biased forecasts. So a lot to do, but better data are a cheap and simple way to be able to manage this tremendous uncertainty that we're living through.
Thanks so much for your insights today.
Thank you, Ramia.